We're here to talk about, tonight we are here to talk about Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the Rothschild family. He was the founder, as we're going to hear from Rabbi Hersh. And the Rothschild family name has long been associated with wealth, power, influence. They've inspired admiration, suspicion, and even, I think you're aware of this, conspiracy theories, from claims of controlling global banking systems to outlandish ideas like the Rothschild space lasers. The name has remained part of modern discourse, a very unusual thing for families of the yesteryear to still dominate headlines in the present. Social media platforms are rife with theories about the family's supposed secret control over government, international finance, and even weather patterns. And in 2021, as you may recall, US Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene faced widespread criticism for suggesting that the Rothschilds were involved in funding space-based lasers that allegedly caused wildfires in California, appropriate for today, a claim that encapsulated the bizarre and unfounded rumors that have trailed the family for centuries. Stories of Rothschild influence are not confined to modern times. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers and political pamphlets often accused the Rothschilds of manipulating wars and economies for personal financial gain. In 1846, the Times of London published reports suggesting that Nathan Mayer Rothschild profited massively from early knowledge of Napoleon's defeat in Waterloo. Though later this story was debunked, it did fuel narratives of the Rothschilds as shadowy puppet masters, a trope that continues to appear in online forums and modern conspiracy documentaries. Despite these sensationalized claims, the Rothschilds' historical influence is rooted in actual real achievements. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the dynasty's founder, established a banking empire from humble beginnings, as we will hear, in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt. His strategic partnership and emphasis on family unity laid the groundwork for a global financial network that transformed banking practices, not just then, for all time, to this day. Which brings me to our presenter tonight. He's here with us, and we welcome him, Rabbi Aubrey Hersh. Thank you. He is a distinguished educator and historian. He's from London. He was born and raised in the UK. We were together not that long ago in Gateshead Yeshiva. I'll leave you to guess how long ago that was. And he was also in Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Rabbi Hersh returned to the UK in 1991, and initially he worked in media and advertising before dedicating himself full-time to Jewish education in 1996. Since then, Rabbi Hersh has been a senior lecturer at the Jewish Learning Exchange, the JLE, in London, where he teaches philosophy, history, and halakha. He's lectured extensively both in the UK and internationally. In addition to his teaching, Rabbi Hersh has led over 350 heritage tours across Europe, visiting significant Jewish historical sites in cities such as Krakow, Prague, Paris, Amsterdam, and Budapest. Since 2003, he has specialized in Holocaust education, collaborating with institutions like the Imperial War Museum and Yad Vashem, as well as notable figures such as the late Sir Martin Gilbert, and also Father Patrick Desbois, who has, of course, also visited our community here in Beverly Hills. In May 2021, Rabbi Hersh launched the popular Jewish history podcast. It's called History for the Curious, which has gained a substantial global audience, and we are delighted to welcome him here with us tonight. And tonight, Rabbi Hersh will share his insights into the Rothschild family, one of the most famous families of Jewish history, the Rothschild banking family, and we thank you so much for being here. What makes the Rothschild name so famous and enduring internationally? Let's begin at the beginning, but really we're beginning at the end, which is The reality is the Rothschild family is so well known, continues to be talked about. It's a name that people are familiar with and recognize. Why do you think that is? And perhaps use that as an introduction platform for tonight's talk.
So, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak here. Really, I had nothing else to do at what is now 3:15 in the morning for me, having just got off a plane from the UK. But in all seriousness, it's great to be here again, I would say, because 2 years ago I passed through LA and had the opportunity to speak here as well. Rothschild, as you say, has an enduring legacy. And the interesting thing is that if you have a look at the screen that's currently showing, it gives his date of birth as 1743, 1744. And since it's not given to many of us to be born more than once, the fact is that we don't really know in which of those 2 years he was born, because his background was not one of wealth or of fame, and there can be few people about whom one would have said they were less qualified to become an international phenomenon than Mayer Amschel Rothschild. Yet, as you pointed out, it's something that has endured through the centuries. And I think perhaps as a starter, and we'll come back to elaborate on this perhaps later this evening, it is a combination of wealth, power, and discretion. It wasn't simply that the Rothschild dynasty had a lot of assets, had a lot of money. It was that they were actually in a controlling position in certain ways in terms of European finance. They were the Bank of Europe, for want of another expression. Now, as you can well imagine, this is going to feed into anti-Semitism, that they're actually running our lives. And indeed, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which only came out 100 years almost after Mayer Amschel had passed, it is modeled to a certain extent around his achievement. Here is a person who every so often would sit and decide the fate of countries. Now, that's simplistic and it's untrue. Nevertheless, there is a kernel of truth in that governments would come to them for assistance. And in that sense, you have the coming together of wealth and power, but there is a tremendous discretion in that nobody knew exactly what and when. And to this day, because Rothschild is a private bank, or indeed a series of banks across the world, they don't declare assets in the way that public companies would. So no one quite knows where they are at. And that mystique, coupled with being able to translate the wealth into the modern era, has endured, has given them a legacy which very few have been able to emulate, which very few have been able to associate with. And if we have a look, this is two different images of what Mayer Amschel Rothschild is supposed to have looked like. There is perhaps a basis which is the equivalent of both. The big difference between the two is, did he or did he not have a beard? It is highly unlikely that he did not, for reasons that we will see. His lifestyle was one where he never really moved out of the ghetto in Frankfurt. And the image on the right was created a lot later, after his death, by somebody who had never met him and was simply picking up on what would have been a popular mode at the time. But Rothschild was unashamedly Jewish, and in fact couldn't have been otherwise. There was no way to hide identity, and in fact, this was something that initially dogged him and afterwards was a title or an insult, but was a constant. Now, if we move from there to what became of Rothschild over the centuries, the popular song, If I Were a Rich Man, was modelled on Rothschild, and in fact, in its original Yiddish version was Wollte ich gewähne a Rothschild. It just didn't translate that well into English, but that was its origins. He was the symbol in the Jewish world, but equally, when the Nazis made their infamous film, The Eternal Jew, which was available in any of the countries that they subsequently occupied in the native language, be it France, be it Holland, and they wanted to talk about the influence, the negative influence that Jews have had on society. So they have at one stage these Jews morphing into rats. But you also had an extract of a film or dramatization of Rothschild that was made in the 1930s. It was incorporated into this film because that was Rothschild's international, as he was seen in the eyes of his detractors and his enemies.
So you've taken us quite far into the Rothschild legacy, as it were, and we're going to get to that in much broader detail. Let's say more granulated in a moment. What I'm really interested in hearing, I think everybody here would like to know, is this person whose year of birth we're not even certain of, was obviously born into a Jewish family that wasn't well known, but what do we know about his origins? Who were his family? Who was his father, his mother, his uncles, his aunts, his cousins? There were, and we're going to talk about them as well in a minute, there were popular banking families and royal courtier Jews, court Jews as they were known, of which his family were not a part.
No.
So where did he come from? What were his origins?
What was his route to becoming the individual that he did? So his family had lived in Frankfurt for centuries, and it's ironic that they were saddled with the name, or given the name, Rothschild. At the time, no one had surnames in the Jewish world. That occurs later on in the Austrian Empire after 1781, in Lithuania in the 1800s. So at the time, people did not have an official name by which they were known. And there was often an association with something that gave you your appellation. It could be de Hoiche, because this person was tall, or it could be this person is named after their mother, and we have the Marsha, who is one of the commentaries on the Talmud, Rav Shmuel Edel's. Edel was his mother. So that's how he became known. In the case of Rothschild, the family, going back 2 centuries, had lived in a house, or part of a house, in the Judengasse in Frankfurt that had a red shield on the gate. And that's where the name came from. But by the time Mayer Amschel was born, they were living in a different location, still within that Judengasse, which was called the Saucepan. And that's really what his surname should be. Perhaps not as glamorous. But if anything, I mean, eventually he would rise through the ranks and afford a house in the Frankfurt ghetto, and it was called the Green Shield House. So that really should be his name for posterity. Nevertheless, history has a vote, and that's the way it has voted. His family were traders. They were living in the oldest ghetto in Europe. People often assume that it was Venice at the very beginning of the 1500s. In fact, Frankfurt precedes it by 30 years. A quarter of a mile piece of land, really it's one street, which was never wider than 12 foot at any stage. And when it was initially created, there were 110 Jews living there. By the time we get to Mayer Amschel Rothschild, there are 3,000, but they're still living in exactly the same amount of real estate. One of the things that they had to do is build a double row of houses so that the back garden simply saw the birth of another set of houses, and people built upwards. The modern skyscraper was built not voluntarily, but simply because there was no other option. And the higher up you went, the less wealthy an individual was, or really the poorer an individual was. And initially, when Rothschild was born, they lived in a quarter of a house. And even when he was able to afford to buy a house, which was a major event in the ghetto, this house had 2 bedrooms, one for him and his wife, and one for the 10 children. So these children, who between them would become the wealthiest Jews in all of Europe, were brought up in one room. And the house itself was somewhere between 10 and 12 foot wide and 38 foot deep. In order to get to the first floor, there wasn't a balustrade, there weren't railings, there were steps and there was a rope. And that's how you got up the stairs. And everything else was given over to merchandise, because before they went into pure banking, so to speak, they were dealing, as many Jews were, in trade, not quite in schmutters, but they were dealing in silk and other materials, but every available space in the house was given over to it. Now, interestingly, we'll have to go through a couple of, well, perhaps we'll go back a moment. That is the middle building is the house, but at a later period. And this is a drawing, an etching of the Judengasse, and you get an idea of the width of the streets. But here you see the ghetto area colored in, and to the right you have the cemetery. In fact, that cemetery still stands to this day. It's maybe 150 yards away from Rothschild's house. And amazingly, his tombstone, his matzeva, has survived. There are only probably about 40 or 50 tombstones that survived the Nazi onslaught. One of them is the mother of the Chassam Sefer. Famously, he was born in Frankfurt. And there are a number of the tombstones of a number of famous rabbis, like the Pnei Yeshua and the Haflah. But in the main, this is a cemetery that dates back to the 1400s. There's virtually nothing left of it. His tombstone is one of the few that survived. Now, there is a particular bracha, particular mitzvah that we carry out once every 28 years. Birkas Hachama, saying a blessing over the sun when it completes what's called the Machzor Gadol, the longer sort of revolution. The lunar cycle is 19 years, but the solar cycle is 28 years. Once every 28 years, and therefore generally a person in their lifetime, depending on exactly when they were born, will say it 3 times, 4 times, maybe 5 times if it particularly works out with their time of birth. In Frankfurt, they used to say Birkas Hachama, used to say this blessing in the cemetery. And a question arose as to why this was the case. There's a very simple reason behind the answer. There was no other area unencumbered by buildings in Jewish hands. They couldn't see the sun in the ghetto. The only place they could go on a Wednesday morning, which is always when we say Birkas HaChamor, is this open area, which was the cemetery. And that gives you an idea of the narrow straits that the cemetery, that the ghetto itself created. And there were a host of restrictions, besides for the type of dress that they had to adopt and the toll that they had to pay when they entered the city, and the fact that they were forbidden to walk more than 2 Jews at a time into the non-Jewish parts of Krakow. Sorry?
Frankfurt.
In Frankfurt, yes. And they also were unable to buy fruit and vegetables at the town market until a certain time in the day where all the non-Jews had already passed through. And this is similar to, early Nazi period, where there were curfews and such like placed upon the Jews, but in this case, it lasted for centuries. And therefore, when Rothschild is born into this, he's born into poverty. He is born into a place which, as the ghetto was described, you didn't need to know where it was to locate it. You could smell it. Because what type of hygiene could they possibly keep there? The sewage system was abysmal because they had no real other options. And therefore, coming from this background, one would have written off all the Jews coming out of there, but it produced doctors, it produced people of note, of scholarship in the Jewish world, and it produced Rothschild. So, there was, he had every strike against him, yet somehow managed, as did quite a number of others, to rise above the circumstances into which they were placed. There was a 60% greater mortality rate for Jews of Frankfurt than non-Jews, unsurprisingly. And the route forward that Rothschild managed to tread really could not have happened without what we would call in Hebrew hashgacha pratis, without God intervening. Because otherwise, as you can understand from all these strikes that were there, it couldn't have happened.
Well, it sounds like Frankfurt Ghetto was an extraordinary petri dish that produced, first of all, the great Rothschild family, but also some of the great rabbinic luminaries and a community that was the pride of European Jewry.
Yep.
It was considered, the Frankfurt Best Inn was considered the most superior Best Inn in all the German-speaking provinces.
And indeed, you've written.
And I've written about it.
Yes,
but it's quite something. But what I want to understand is, I do understand that. What is it? What was the big break that Rothschild had that turned him from being a local trader, probably very parochial in his business dealings? What was the big break that brought him into the world of banking and that catapulted him into world renown?
So really, it happened in stages. He was sent to learn in yeshiva as a teenager. He wasn't quite what we would call a teenager because he hadn't made it to 13. He was 12. And the family was a very religious family. Everyone in the ghetto was religious. And he had an aptitude. So they sent him to study in southern Germany to the east of Frankfurt. But within 6 months of him arriving there, there was a plague of smallpox in the ghetto. And
which city was it?
Sorry, where was he? In Fulda.
Fulda.
Fulda, near Nuremberg. Fulda was a well-known town. I mean, it's small, but Nuremberg was the largest city in the vicinity.
Which city?
Fulda, Fulda. Yeah. And within a very short space of time, both his parents fell victim to this plague, and he was left an orphan. And they found him an apprenticeship, his uncles, who also lived in the same house as he did, given the space. That is not exactly surprising. But they apprenticed him out to the Oppenheimer family, who had a bank in Hanover. And you mentioned about court Jews. The Oppenheimers were known for it. And in fact, the Yud Sus, 35 years later, one of the Oppenheimers would fall from grace when his patron...
executed, wasn't he?
Sorry, he was executed. That's right. Yeah. Publicly paraded in a cage and then executed when his patron died. So, you know, the risks that a court Jew had were you never know what tomorrow was going to bring. And that was one of the reasons that Rothschild didn't elect to tread that path, even though he was given an apprenticeship by them in the banking world. And the idea was that he would become a bank clerk and eventually, you know, go through the ranks within a bank rather than within the banking system in Europe. But what he did pick up while he was there was that wealthy people, and by that I mean the rulers, Germany was not a united country. It had different fiefdoms and dukedoms and provinces. The whole of Germany was rife with different ruling families who ruled over, you know, a couple of 100 square miles each. What he picked up from them was that they had a mania for collecting things, especially coins. And he learned to understand the value of these coins, which each little dukedom produced in its own right. After the wars in Europe had died down, the 7 Years' War in particular, in 1763, he comes back to Frankfurt because once his apprenticeship is over, he no longer has rights of residence in Hanover. So he has to go back home. So he's got to go back to the ghetto. And he joins with the family in trading. Now, Frankfurt was a trade route. It was a city on trade routes both north-south and east-west. So it was known for what really were the trade fairs that took place there, with tens of thousands of people coming to buy and sell a range of merchandise. But because each one of these little principalities had their own coinage, you needed to exchange your coins for what would be universally accepted at the Frankfurt trade fairs. And often it was Jews who were running these, you can't really call them banks, it was really a desk, you know, and
money change.
Exactly, money changers. But you had to be up to date. You had to know how much things were worth.
And it wasn't based on the weight of the silver or the gold?
Not per se, because different places had different reputations for how much they would water down their coinage.
The purity
Yes.
of the silver,
Right.
the purity of the
Yes.
gold.
Yes, and also for the fact that how much was available in a tiny little fiefdom in comparison to how much Frankfurt would produce, or one of these larger places.
So a Frankfurt coin was more reliable
Yes.
than a coin from Fulda, let's say. I'm just making that up.
Probably, yes, yeah,
Right.
yes. And if you knew your exchange rates, which were not published, you know, on NASDAQ or anywhere else, you just had to have the information to hand, you could make money. You could make a living. That's as far as it would go, but you were still making a living as a result.
And the margins were based on the value of silver or the value of the coinage?
It was based also on how much the person selling it needed to sell their coins, and how ignorant they were of the exchange rates.
Right.
You know, there were edges that you could have within transactions. Now, Rothschild was one of the people who joined in with this, but he never gave up his interest in coins. And he would bend the ear of wealthy patrons of these Frankfurt fairs and interest them in his old coin collection. And he would sell not so much for a profit, but for connections. Relationships. He wanted to make sure that these people remembered him, would know who he was. And in fact, he even started what you might call a mail order catalogue of these coins, of which we still have a couple of pages in the Rothschild archives in London, whereby he would send out to princes and dukes around the country what was available to be bought, and he was open to be bargained down, because the main thing was the relationship. And so he would make a little bit of money on that, but his essence was this petty trading.
So, I mean, that obviously gave him a start, but that wasn't enough. He built up wealth over time. And how do you build on those initial achievements and preserve his wealth and advance his influence? How did he transition from doing this kind of local, quite petty business and relationships? Relationships are wonderful, but relationships have to translate themselves into profit if you want to become wealthy. And what were the key factors and strategies behind his shift from being this petty coin dealer into becoming a world-class banker?
So, still two stages. We'll deal with the first stage. And that's this gentleman here, Prince William of Hesse, who really had an enormous influence over Rothschild's fortunes, and is now almost unknown. Rothschild's fame has by far eclipsed Prince William. But back in the 1700s, that would not have been the case at all. This guy's grandfather owned a small parcel of land, almost, in Germany, in Hesse, and made it his business to lend out his troops, the Hessian troops. In fact, they were used by the British in this country, while we, and I'll use the term we because there are two Brits here in the audience.
Oh, wow.
Have you got an American passport?
I do.
You do, but you still have both.
I represent both sides.
Right.
By the way, Rothschild was accused of that as well.
Oh, yes, more than once. The British needed troops, especially in the New York area in the 1770s, in order to contain these American revolutionary upstarts. And he and his grandfather, Prince William's grandfather and father, were supplying these troops across Europe, and in this case, across the world. Mercenaries. But mercenaries who themselves had no choice in the matter. They were sort of pressed into service. They were mercenaries only in the sense that the crown prince was making money off them and they were fighting a war in a foreign country.
Presumably they were paid a salary or something.
Yes, but that was about it. But they had no choice as to whether they wanted to fight or not.
Right.
And it was quite brutal, in fact, the conditions under which they existed. Now, his grandfather made the mistake of converting from being a Protestant to being a Catholic. And his wife was horrified, so she took the kids and went to Copenhagen, went to Denmark, where her sister happened to be the queen. She and her sister were both children of George II, the King of England. So we're talking about a very well-connected royal family in Europe. The grandfather basically lived in isolation, a very strange person. The father was very religious, also is responsible for bringing the potato to Germany, but polished his soldiers such that they became internationally renowned. And the son, Crown Prince William, had two interests in life when he took over the principality. One was making money, and one was fathering children. He had at least 20, through a whole string of wives, mistresses, and whatnot. He might have had as many as 40 and possibly 60 children during his lifetime. Why he had this desire rather than to simply have a fling is not quite known, but nevertheless, this was something that he did. And he had, unsurprisingly, a person who was occupied dealing with Prince William's personal finances. Rather than sort of his European-wide investments, this person dealt with making sure that all the various women and children in his life were provided for, and that they had a palatial accommodation in which to live. So it was quite the job, quite a full-time occupation. This guy, called Buderus, came across Rothschild, or really Rothschild came across him. And Rothschild started courting his favor as a way into the crown prince. And it worked. Over the years, initially in 1769, Rothschild was awarded the right to announce himself as a court factor to Prince William, which actually means nothing at all. It means, as, let's say, in the United Kingdom, various brands can have on their packaging by appointment to His Royal Highness.
Cadbury's has just lost theirs, I read.
Oh, is that the case?
Apparently, it's a terrible thing, but it has no practical application.
None at all. Kellogg's Cornflakes, I believe, still does have it. So it's simply that at one stage, you know, Queen Elizabeth ate a bowl of cornflakes, and more or less that's how these things came into being. It didn't denote any position of rank or any privileges, but it meant that you had traded with Prince William. And that came about through Buderus. But later on, in either 83 or 84, he was given a gate pass, because being in the ghetto meant that every night you were locked in. It also meant that on Sundays and on Christian festivals, you couldn't leave the ghetto at all, by day or night. And that limited your ability to travel around Germany, trading and trying to interest people in your coins and in relationships. In the 1780s, Buderus gets him a ghetto pass. He's now allowed out at night and allowed to sleep in different parts, to be in different parts of Germany. And all of that, what it really does is it has the effect of allowing Rothschild to be in more than one place. He's now no longer confined purely to Frankfurt, although his house and his quote-unquote bank is still in the Green Shield, in this little building in the Judengasse, but he now is able to trade in different places with far greater ease. And that's the beginnings of his fortune. That's the first stage.
So, I remember hearing as a child that there was some rabbi that blessed Rothschild, and that's why he became wealthy. And that was, I guess, a legend or some kind of myth that tended the Rothschild family to being initially very religious. But we don't really know whether he was, from what you've told us, we don't know whether he remained religious or started drifting away from religion. Of course, this was the age of the Enlightenment, when people, not just Jews, but Christians as well, were drifting away from religious belief and religious practice. How religious was Mayer Amschel Rothschild, and how did he conduct himself as compared to the other court Jews? You've mentioned Oppenheim, they were rabbis, and Samson Wertheimer was a rabbi. So was he a similar ilk, or was he different?
So he's sort of, I would say, halfway between the two. The legends that associate Rothschild's wealth with a blessing which either he or potentially his father obtained under circumstances which also vary with the legend, are, as they stand, almost impossible to not only to verify, but to believe, because there are holes in these legends. In fact, I produced a podcast on Rothschild, and I put out to the listeners, can any of you come back to me with an answer as to what you attribute to his wealth in spiritual terms? People become wealthy every day. But somebody who has not just wealth in his own lifetime, but is able to continue it for generation after generation through the ages, that's highly unusual. And that speaks of something which is more than business acumen. That really points to something which has a spiritual origin. What is it? I haven't found an answer that works either geographically or historically. For one reason or another, the answers that I was provided with, which are associated with the legend that you mentioned, don't work. I will say one other thing, and that is the Rothschild dynasty created legends. They wanted an area, or really an aura, of mystery or mystique to surround them.
It was a branding exercise.
Absolutely. And this, it really starts with Nathan Rothschild, the third son of Mayer Amschel, who was in England. And he is the first one to really become what you would nowadays call a multimillionaire, potentially in today's term translated as a billionaire. And he actually encouraged legends. And it's possible that he was not averse to the Times thinking that he had profited from the Battle of Waterloo and pre-knowledge, even though nowadays we know that that was not really the case. And he might have made some money off it, but nowhere near what was attributed to him. Having said that, the Times article was in 1846. He was dead 10 years by then. But nevertheless, they did bring things to bear, and therefore there is no such thing as an authoritative biography of the Rothschilds, even the ones that in the introduction make it clear that they had unlimited access to the Rothschild archives. That could be, but you can't trust the Rothschild archives. As a point in case, in 1901, maybe we'll come back to this later, when the Frankfurt branch, the Frankfurt Bank closed down, they destroyed most of their archives. It wasn't that, the Nazis destroyed it in 38 or 39. There were lots of things they didn't want people to know about, and they supplemented knowledge with rumor, they themselves.
They worked on their own image in that way.
And worked on it not necessarily only to create a positive PR, but to make sure that nobody really knew what was going on.
And was he religious? Was Mayer Amschel religious?
Yes. He was religious his entire life. He and they had 10 children. It was the 5 sons that carried on the banking dynasty, which is why, if we move forward a little bit, there you have the 5 arrows, which was the symbol of the Rothschild Bank still to this day. That comes from the 5 boys that took over the banking dynasty. The eldest, who was the second child, because the first child was a girl, the eldest boy, Amschel, carried on in Frankfurt, the bank, was also religious. The others, far less so. It ranged, between them as to how far they drifted. But Rothschild himself remained religious his entire life. He would daven in shul every day. He would support the yeshiva there in Frankfurt. He would have yeshiva students dine with him. And he was unapologetically religious, not just unapologetically Jewish. And his son, therefore, picked up the positions that he had. He was the gabber of the charity in the ghetto, but very much so he remained religious.
And who was his wife? Did his wife play a role in this?
So yes, not sure where. There we are. We have an image of her. This is a painting that was made by Moritz Oppenheim in 1840. He painted at least 50 paintings of the Rothschild family during his lifetime. Now, what is interesting about his wife, Mayer Amschel died in 1812. She died in 1849, I believe it was, almost 40 years later than him. She remained in the ghetto throughout this period that she was a widow. He remained there. I mean, he could have just about left. Because by 1811, in December 1811, he managed to obtain citizenship for the Jews of Frankfurt. It reverted during the riots in the 1810s and 1820s, and it really wasn't until 1848 that German Jewry was properly emancipated, but at least on paper. Jews were freed at the very end of 1811, for which Rothschild spent a fortune on behalf of his fellow Jews. So he could have left the ghetto, and perhaps even a little bit earlier. But he remained. His wife, though, could definitely have left. When she was still living in the ghetto, her children were living in palaces across Europe. Right? There were 5 boys, Amschel in Frankfurt, Nathan in London, Karl in Naples, Solomon in Vienna, and James in Paris. James was the wealthiest person in France. I don't mean the wealthiest Jew. He was the wealthiest person in all of France at one stage, and lived appropriately.
So
she stays in the ghetto.
She must have been quite a bit younger than her husband, because if he was born in the 1740s and she died in the 1840s, she must have been considerably younger than him.
She wasn't considerably younger. She was about 6 or 7 years younger than him. She was married when she was about 16 or 17, which was quite common at the time. He was in his 20s. You weren't allowed to get married in the Judengasse until you were in your 20s. And in fact, there were only 12 marriages allowed a year because of the overcrowding.
I must wonder why people continue to live there, why the Jewish community continued to live there if life was so difficult.
Because you needed rights of residence to live in other places. I mean, to contrast this to Bohemia and Moravia, to the Austro-Hungarian or the Habsburg Empire as it was at exactly this time, there was a limit on how many Jews could live in Moravia and Bohemia. Those numbers were fixed in the 1740s, in the time of Maria Theresa. In Bohemia, it was 5,400 and something, And in Moravia, it was 8,000 and whatever. And those numbers could not change for a century. Until the middle of the 1800s, the Jewish population in these places were not allowed to increase.
So what happens if it wasn't static? Well, I mean, because you don't know when someone's going to die. You may know when someone's going to have a baby, but you don't know when somebody's going to die.
They weren't allowed to get married. Franz Kafka is from that part of the world. I know we're straying off our topic at the moment. His grandfather gets married very late because he's not allowed to get married until somebody dies. So you either got married illegally and you had children who were called malachim, they were angels because they weren't registered anywhere, or you left the country, or you just waited.
There was nowhere to go. Where would they go?
Yes, so you went to seek your fortunes perhaps in America, or, it really was not easy. And therefore there were few options available to them. The Jews in Spain, they were still the Inquisition still existed until the 1830s. So they couldn't go there and they couldn't go to Portugal. In Italy, they were still in ghettos. In Rome in particular.
That's why so many Jews went to Holland and went to the UK or Great Britain as it was then, because there was far fewer restrictions against Jews.
Yes, yeah. Although the numbers still were such that the community couldn't support Jews coming in. In England, let's say, it was the Sephardi community that was the wealthy community, and after a while they would send you back if you were not self-sufficient.
They would have you deported.
They would stop supporting you, and therefore you couldn't exist.
Let's go back to the Rothschild. So
yes,
he had five sons.
So just one thing about his wife that I wanted to say about this painting. In front of her, she has a copy of a Frankfurt newspaper, and on top of it, a siddur. And it's the siddur which was the Nusach of Frankfurt, which was the way that they prayed in Frankfurt. And the fact that it's in this painting is not an accident. Most paintings of the Rothschilds neither have background, this has the background of the Judengasse, nor have anything in front of them. It's just, as you might expect, a portrait in and of itself.
Although that was a common thing to have motifs in portraits where people were holding things or had things on their clothes.
Yes,
that was quite
common. But then it was a more sort of a general suggestion as to what this person's interests were. Right. Here, the siddur actually speaks.
So she must have been a very religious woman.
Yes.
Remained religious.
And while her...
Did she come from a banking family?
A minor banking family in Frankfurt as well, within the ghetto.
A local parochial petty banker.
Yes, correct. Yeah, and her sons, when they were ruling Europe, came and saw her. They couldn't come in a carriage. They had to get out the carriage and walk through the mud in order to get to her house, and they were billionaires. But that's where she lived.
So let's talk about the sons, the five sons, you've named them. I also want to know a little bit about the five daughters. I'm assuming they all lived into adulthood, the five sons, because they all ran banking branches across Europe. Tell us a little bit about why they got involved in the business and how this idea of franchising out the Rothschild name, which was very unique in terms of, although all bankers and all traders in those days, Jewish traders, had branches in London and Amsterdam, in Italy. That wasn't an abnormal thing. The Jewish community was international. But international banking was not a thing. Right.
I would, though, say that even though international trade, Jews were very involved in it, but not within the family. In other words, they would have somebody with whom they did business in different countries. That was one area in which Rothschild managed to change his own fortunes, because it was his own family that were running branches.
So when he was giving business to, let's say, the Naples branch or the Paris branch, it really was family that was making money.
Right. So let's talk about this, because this is integral to Rothschild's wealth. Only family. It wasn't that they did trade beyond. They would only trade with family. Now, of course, the people they were lending money to or helping or collecting loans on behalf of were across Europe. But it was only the family that was allowed to be involved, and only the sons, to the degree that no daughter was given access to the records of the banking empire, and neither would a daughter-in-law. If the son died, the business would carry on to the son, which is why the Frankfurt branch eventually closed, because there were no male heirs. There were two girls that didn't cut it.
Did they inherit the money, or they didn't inherit the money?
Everybody was very well provisioned, but they had absolutely no say in
the business.
In the business at all.
And the business was only loans and mortgages, or was it investment banking as well?
It was everything. Initially, it was really borrowing from one to lend to another.
The most basic banking is you've got capital and you lend it out so that you can make money on interest. That's the basic level of banking, which had been the Jewish practice of money lending, essentially. Right. But what they did is that they also issued bonds.
Right.
And they did investment banking. So that changed the dynamic of Jewish banking and banking, actually.
Yes. Yeah. Now that happens because of the last stage in Rothschild's fortune, and that is Napoleon. Napoleon's invasion of Germany meant a number of things, but one of the things it meant was that Prince William's extended family in Europe needed loans from him. He didn't want to lend them money because he didn't want them to know how much money he had. So Rothschild convinced Buderus to convince Prince William that the best way to lend money to, for instance, your brother-in-law who's the king of Denmark is anonymously. Find an anonymous individual who you can trust who will lend the money on your behalf. Bloke called Rothschild. He would do perfectly, and Buderus put the money his way, and that was his first international transaction.
So he wasn't even playing with his own money at that stage?
No. He did not have that type of money at all.
So how did he work the margin for that? But he was taking a percentage of the profit.
Yeah, actually not a large percentage, less than 2%. But he was now breaking in to the international financial world, and the non-Jews were aghast. The banking families, Berman and all these people, they were outraged that this Jew should have a hand in international finance, but it was too late. And then what happens is that Napoleon in 1806 manages to capture Prince William's dukedom. And he has hundreds of chests of silver and silk and all this type of stuff. And he hides them all over his castle. And basically they get found by the French general that Napoleon had sent there, a guy called General Lagrange.
The marshal.
Was he a marshal? I don't... maybe. His initial rank was definitely that of a general.
Napoleon loved his 6'2" marshals. That was his thing.
Oh, I see. But maybe that was more for when he was going out towards Russia. Yeah. But this was a guy who was basically in charge of getting hold of Prince William's wealth. Now, most of the stuff, the goods, were found. Buderus was left behind. He negotiated a bribe to Lagrange, and the rest of the money was kept and ended up with Prince William. But there were 4 boxes that made their way to Rothschild. He couldn't have held more than 4 boxes in his little house in the Judengasse. These boxes were the loans. People who owed Prince William money.
The notes.
The notes, the promissory notes. He and his sons traveled around Europe, making sure that these loans got paid. And it's at this stage that we talk about the coaches, the Rothschild coaches that had false compartments in. They didn't have false compartments for gold and silver because you can't really keep much in a coach. They had false compartments for the paperwork. And they were operating under the nose of Napoleon. And in fact, Mayer Amschel's house gets raided by the police, by Napoleon's army, looking for money, looking for this stuff, and they don't find it.
Because it's what the notes are worth money.
The notes are worth everything. And in particular, the Hessian troops, which the British owed money for. By now, Mayer Amschel's third son, Nathan, has been in London for quite some while. He was initially in Manchester, now he's in London. And he's given these notes drawn on the British government. Bonds. Now, what Nathan does is he bides his time. He's not going to cash this in immediately. He's going to wait for the market to peak. And nobody really understands who these notes belong to. He puts it out there that they're his. And therefore in England, as far as the government is concerned and as far as the banking world is concerned, the Rothschilds are a bank. They're not a middleman. They're not working on commission. These are their notes. They bought them from Prince William, who fled into exile.
Right. So they think they're liquid.
Right. So not only does he now have capital for the first time, but he can afford to wait till the market works his way, because he'll pay off Prince William as and when.
But they didn't betray Prince William.
They gave him back every penny, everything.
They remained totally trustworthy. That was another thing about the Rothschilds. Is their name never went downhill.
That's right. They paid back. The one thing they did do was Nathan was very, very shrewd. He saw waves coming in the banking industry, and he knew when to sell and buy. And so he now makes independent capital in London because of Napoleon's invasion and because Prince William needs these promissory notes cashed. And he manages, because the payments then get made in England and transferred to Napoleonic Europe by smuggling.
They smuggled cash.
They smuggled gold into Europe and got it to Prince William. There was a whole smuggling network. I mean, this is too long a story to deal with this evening.
It's money laundering, essentially.
But it's more than... Napoleon encouraged smuggling at one stage. He opened a house, an area, where 300 smugglers could stay overnight, because he was told by his finance minister that the more gold that leaves England, the poorer they're going to be. And at some stage in Napoleon's Odyssey, James, the youngest child, the one who I said in Paris becomes the wealthiest individual in France, he has already established himself there. He is now taking this gold that's being smuggled in, and rather than using it for the French, takes it to Naples, and it ends up paying the Duke of Wellington. I mean, it's quite complex how they set everything up beyond that, but it was unbelievable.
We joked before that Rothschild played both sides.
Yes.
They certainly did play both sides.
Absolutely.
They understood how to use the international banking system
to
make sure they made money, and they didn't really care who was at war with whom.
Correct.
It didn't matter who won the war.
No. Although in later years, I would say by the time you get to 1825, the Rothschilds prefer a Europe without war than a Europe with war, because by now they owned bonds in the countries, and war makes these things very volatile. They didn't want that anymore.
Because then the bond value goes down.
Could tank. Whereas initially they made their money off war because they didn't have capital.
So it's not entirely inaccurate to say that the Rothschilds were behind things in a kind of nefarious way.
I wouldn't use the term nefarious, and nor even the term behind things. It depends how you mean behind things. They stood to gain and made profits, whichever side was losing or winning, through very shrewd investment and, as you said, playing both sides. That's true.
So, I mean, nowadays we have this talk about the conspiracy of the military-industrial complex. In a way, it's similar to that. I mean, from a financial standpoint, it doesn't really matter who's doing what, as long as the business keeps coming, right. That's what matters.
Yes.
All right. Fascinating.
Yes.
So, when did the sons get involved in the business? Was it the late 1700s or
yes.
the late 1700s?
Already then, by the time Amschel and Solomon, one was 16, one was 17, they were already in the business. And Nathan already goes to England in the he was born 1777. He is already in England in the late 1790s when he's 20. They're all pressed into the business as soon as they reach their older teens.
Right, so it sounds like the brothers didn't really remain religious, but there was one, at least, grandchild who was very religious, who lived in Frankfurt. Tell us a little bit about Willie, Willie Rothschild.
So, Amschel is the son of Mayer Amschel. They all have repeating names. Amschel is the one of the 5 brothers who remains religious, bless you, and he continues the bank in Frankfurt. He dies without children. He has a brother in Naples, Karl. But the Naples bank eventually closes when Napoleon is no longer, by now we mean Napoleon III, no longer has a say in Naples. So the Naples bank closes. 2 sons of Karl, nephews of Amschel, and therefore grandchildren of Mayer Amschel, of the founder, 2 of his grandsons take over the Frankfurt branch, one of whom is Wilhelm, who's known as Willie. And he is religious. He is known as the Rothschild Tzaddik. In fact, I was checking while I was flying over on the plane today, even on Wikipedia, he's written up as being the Orthodox, righteous Wilhelm Rothschild. And he, in fact, supported Rabbi Hersh in his Auschwitz, because that's all happening in Frankfurt, right? That's 1851, post the era of the Judengasse, but still the same city. He bankrolls him to a large degree, and he will remain religious to his last day.
And he manages the Frankfurt branch.
He manages the Frankfurt. He has a brother. His brother dies in 1888. He dies in 1901. And when he dies, because he only has 2 daughters, the Frankfurt branch closes as well.
They didn't bring in another Rothschild from elsewhere.
No. Yeah.
And he's buried not far away from Samson Raphael Hersh.
That's right. Yes, there is the wall between them, but yes,
I've been there, I've seen it.
Yeah, he's buried in the cemetery there, as is Guttele. She's also in that section. She's not where her husband is buried, because by then that cemetery was full.
What influence did the Rothschilds have on European infrastructure, for example, railroads, or generally European infrastructure? What influence they had? We talked about investment banking. I mean, today, the Rothschild Bank is known for massive infrastructure projects, and they get involved in that kind of thing. But was that early on also something that was central?
The emperor of the Austrian, of the Habsburg Empire, Francis I, ennobled the Rothschilds, and that's why they became known as von Rothschild, or in French, de Rothschild, because they were now nobility. And he did so because he needed the second son, Solomon. Amschel stays in Frankfurt, Nathan's in England, the second son is in Vienna. He needs him in Vienna to build the railroads. Ironically, this is a mad thing. In Vienna, Jews were not allowed to own property until the late 1840s. So although Rothschild is ennobled and is living in Vienna, he stays in a hotel. He can't buy a house, even though he runs the country. He's not allowed to buy a house. When he eventually was allowed to, he bought the hotel in which he had stayed, which is just around the corner from the Dorotheengasse in Vienna, where one of the two Jewish museums is. But either way, so very much they're involved there, and James in France is behind the building of the railroads, and in England, Disraeli, when Parliament was out of session in the summer, and the question is what would happen to the Suez Canal, Disraeli arranges a Rothschild loan in the English branch and says to Queen Victoria, "Ma'am, you have it," because the British and the French basically bought the Suez Canal at that stage.
So the Rothschild banking empire seems to be a family affair.
Very much. Very much.
Were there internal rivalries? Did James get on with Nathan? Did Nathan get on with Carl? Or were they sometimes at loggerheads with each other because they had differing interests?
The father, on his deathbed, made it absolutely clear that they must stay together. They must remain unified. And the brothers referred to that. It wasn't just a one-off, but they refer to their father's absolute overriding wish for this unity in correspondence between each other. And when trying to smooth over things.
Because there were obviously areas of tension and conflict.
And they weren't equally as brilliant. You know, Nathan was probably the most brilliant of the five.
He was a natural businessman.
And tempestuous, and I think he was a redhead, I believe so. And, you know, he had a fiery nature to him. And he had to be calmed down. Solomon did a lot of the smoothing, and Amschel as well. But they remained united, living by their father's maxim. And by the way, they would marry, when we talk about the Rothschilds marrying out, we don't mean marrying non-Jews. We mean marrying outside of the Rothschilds. They married nieces and first cousins and whatever in order to keep the trust together.
Within the family.
Within the family. I mean, it broke down by the time you get to the fourth generation, but until then, pretty much that was the case. I think out of 57 weddings, something like 36 were within the family. So they did keep that legacy. If you go to the Rue de la Victoire shul in Paris, it's the big shul, it's the probably the largest in Europe. At the front on the left-hand side, the first row does not have what would you call them, every seat has whatever.
Armrests?
Armrests.
Yes.
There are 5 seats there without armrests. All the rest of the shul has armrests, but not those 5. That's where the Rothschilds sit. There are no barriers between them. That's the
symbolic.
Yes, the official idea. Even though by the time it was built, none of the 5 were alive. But
would have davened in shul.
Right. Yeah, James would have turned up for his wedding, in that type of shul. But they very much had a concept of unity.
So we're going to open up for a couple of questions as well in a moment, because there's so much to talk about. I want to talk about 2 things. First of all, we mentioned some of these famous banking families. Mm-hmm. Some of them we didn't mention. But we mentioned the Wertheimers. We mentioned the Oppenheimers. There were the Da Costas. Yeah. There were the Itzigs. There were Leren's family from Holland. So there were big Jewish banking families. None of those names are remembered. I mean,
except in history.
History nerds like us know about them, but generally speaking, no one's ever heard of them. The Rothschilds managed to outclass them in every possible respect, although these people were probably wealthier than them, at least initially. How do you think they managed to do that? And the last thing I want you to address before we open to question is how many Rothschild branches are there today, and who's the family right now?
Okay, so they're actually opposites, those 2 questions. The Rothschilds managed to carry on going because they carried on a legacy and because there were 6 of them involved, Mayer Amschel and his 5 sons. And that was something that didn't translate with these other banking families for one reason or another. And it did with him, and the unity kept them going and was not applicable to these other families. He also taught them a level of patience and of humility. And that was very much a legacy. He would write to Nathan in London and tell him off for certain things that he had, how he had, done a deal in a particular way. And he basically tutored them into being more patient, into being more humble. And it endured, at least endured for that generation, and really, I would say for 2 generations. And at that stage, Rothschilds was so set up in Europe that by now they had something that would continue. However, it did basically come to an end. There is a Rothschild bank in England, in London. There is a Rothschild bank in Paris. Almost none of it today is in Jewish hands. There are very, very few people that I'm aware of who are Jewish and wealthy and are Rothschilds. Miriam Rothschild was very famous for her work in zoology and botany, and lived in Tring in the family estate. But she wasn't.
I remember Edmund de Rothschild.
Yes.
He died about 20 years ago, but he was the head of the Rothschild family in the UK. And he had children, but I don't think the bank today is in the hands of the British family. It's the French ones who took over, but that one just died, right? Lord Rothschild.
Not long ago, yes.
So
he wasn't Jewish.
And there's no Jewish Rothschilds left in the banking.
Virtually, I don't know of any who have a significant say in the banking world, no.
And they don't lend money anymore, do they? They're really involved in investment banking.
Yes. So they are a private bank,
and they arrange loans, so they're sort of middlemen.
Yes.
So do they have great capital of their own?
Yes. We don't know exactly how much because they don't have to declare all of it, but yes, they are still a player in the financial market. But as you say, they've moved what they do, and they now function as really investment trusts in various projects. And
so, to come back full circle to my introduction, if people accuse the Rothschilds of being behind whatever conspiracy theory is the most popular one on X or TikTok, it's not even anti-Semitism because they're not Jewish.
But nobody knows that. They feel they're accusing Jews.
In reality, it remains an anti-Semitic claim.
Yeah.
But actually, it's of no consequence because they're not Jewish, and the banking that they do is no resemblance to what they were doing in the Napoleonic Wars.
Correct.
And so it's really a bit of an empty. An empty accusation.
Right, which is why I say the 2 questions were opposite to each other. The one is why they managed to endure, and they did for 4 generations. But after that, it started falling apart, and by now it has basically come apart at the seams.
Nothing. The name exists, but that's it.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.